Honoria Rookwood sat on the pauper's bench in mourning black gone grey at the seams, and no one in the Marlcombe Sessions House rose to give an old woman a chair. She did not ask for one. When she stood to speak for a weaver about to lose his loom, Magistrate Silas Thorne said, "Before a gallery of 9 and 40, this bench has no ear for beggars in borrowed black." The room laughed, but in her reticule lay a folded letter under a black wax seal, and the clerk kept glancing at the ring on her worn glove. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Subscribe before we begin and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let me tell you what happened the morning the whole court laughed at the wrong woman. It was a quarter day in Marlcombe, one of those Lancashire mill towns that grew up around the water and the wool, all soot and slate and the far-off clack of looms that never quite stopped. The Sessions House sat on the corner of the market square, a squat stone building with a clock that ran 4 minutes slow and had for as long as anyone could remember. Inside, on that cold morning, the debtor's court was filling up. She came in with the others. Nobody looked at her twice. Why would they? She was an old woman in mourning black, and the black had gone grey at the seams the way black does when it has been worn too long and brushed too often. Her bonnet was plain. Her gloves were worn thin at the fingertips. She carried a small reticule of dark cloth, and she moved slow the way the old move, and she found herself a place on the long bench at the back where the poor sat to wait their turn. The pauper's bench, they called it. She sat down on it, and no one rose to give an old woman a chair. Now, you'd think somebody might have. A clerk, a constable, some young man with manners his mother taught him. But it was a busy morning, and she was only one more shabby figure among 40 others. And in a room like that, a person learns to see past the poor the way you see past the furniture. So she sat, and here is the first thing you should know about her. She did not ask for a chair. She did not look about with that hungry, pleading look the desperate wear. She folded her hands in her lap, and she waited, and she watched everything with a pair of grey eyes that missed nothing at all. Her name was Honoria Rookwood. There was a ring on her right hand over the worn glove, a mourning ring, jet black, set with a small red stone. Bloodstone, if you knew your stones, and cut into that stone, so small you'd need to lean close to see it, was a little bird with its wings spread and no feet. A martlet, the heralds call it. She turned that ring on her finger now and again without seeming to know she did it, round and round, the way a body worries at a thing it has carried a long time. I will tell you what most of that room did not know. 3 years a widow she was, and the man she had buried, Lord Rookwood, had once stood in this very town and put his name and his money to a promise. This Sessions House, the stone and the roof and the bench she sat on, he had paid for it. Endowed it, the lawyers say. He had a deed drawn up, sworn and sealed, and in that deed he set down in plain words what the court was for. It was to hear the poorest voice first. That was the whole of it. A rich man's odd little dream that a court might stoop to the smallest and meanest and listen before it turned to the great. He was in his grave now. And Honoria had come, quiet, in her worn black, sitting among the petitioners where no one would know her, to see with her own eyes whether the thing her husband built still kept the word he gave it. That was all she wanted. To see. In her reticule, tucked down beside a handkerchief, there was a letter. Folded small, sealed with a fat blob of black wax. She had carried it 3 years and never opened it, and if you had asked her that morning why, she might have found it hard to say. It meant nothing to anyone but her. She smoothed it once with her thumb through the cloth, feeling the edge of the seal, and then she let it be. The magistrate came in. You would have known him for the master of the place the moment he entered. Silas Thorne, his name was, and he wore his black robe like a man who enjoyed the weight of it. He was perhaps 50, well-fed, with a high colour in his cheeks, and small, quick eyes, and a way of settling into his tall chair that said the chair had been made for him and the town along with it. He did not look at the gallery when he sat. Men like Thorne do not look at the room. They expect the room to look at them. Beside him, at a lower desk, sat the clerk, a thin, grey, careful man named Ambrose Pruitt, with ink on his fingers and a stoop to his shoulders from 30 years of bending over other men's troubles. He had the look of a man who had swallowed a great many words in his life and digested none of them comfortably. The morning began. Case after case, the small miseries of a poor town, a man behind on his rent, a woman whose husband had run off and left her the debts. Thorne dealt with them quick, one after another, hardly lifting his eyes from the papers Pruitt slid before him. Seize the goods. Commit the debtor. Next, there was no cruelty in it that you could point to exactly, only a kind of boredom, which is worse, because cruelty at least knows the man in front of it is a man. Honoria watched. She said nothing. Round and round went the ring. Then the clerk read out a name, and a man rose from the far bench and came forward to the rail, and Honoria's eyes sharpened. Jonah Reed, Pruitt read, in the matter of the Wexbridge Loan and Discount Company. A debt of £58, 12 shillings. Reed was a big man gone lean, a weaver by the stoop of his back and the state of his hands. He had knuckles like a bag of walnuts, and a coat mended so many times it was more mending than coat. He stood at the rail, with his cap crushed in his 2 fists, and he had the terrible dignity of a proud man who has come to a place where his pride is worth nothing. A second man stood too, near the front, and this one was a different sort. Neat, dry, a black coat that fit him and a leather case under his arm. Colley, his name was, agent for the loan company, the sort of man who is sent to collect what other men cannot pay. He had the smooth, unbothered look of one who has done this 100 times and slept well every night after. "Your worship," said Colley, "easy as you like, the debt is long overdue. The company asks the court to grant seizure. The man owns a loom and holds a cottage. Both would answer for the sum." Thorne glanced at the paper. And the debtor, has he anything to say? Reed's throat worked. When he spoke his voice was low and rough, a voice that did not often ask for anything. "Only time, your worship. That's all I'm asking. I've cloth on the loom near finished. Good cloth. If I might have till Martinmas, 7 days, I can sell it and pay a great part of what's owed. Take my loom and I've no way to pay any of it. Take the loom and you take the very thing that had let me clear the debt." It was a good argument. It was, if you think on it, an unanswerable one. A man cannot pay you if you destroy the means by which he earns. Any fool could see it. Thorne did not see it, because Thorne was not looking. He was looking at the clock and at the long list of cases still to come, and he wanted his dinner. 7 days, he said, in a bored drawl that carried to the back of the room. They always want 7 days, and in 7 days it is another 7, and another. I have heard this song, "Weaver, you are a professional pauper, and this bench is not a charity." There was a small ripple of laughter from the gallery. Not much, just enough. The sound a room makes when the powerful man has made his little joke, and the rest wish to show they are on his side of it. Honoria's face did not change, but her hand in her lap closed slowly around the ring. Reed stood very still and took it. That was the worst of it, watching him take it. He had no more words. What words does a man have against a laugh? It was then that a small thing happened that most of the room missed. Out in the corridor, past the open door, a child was coughing. A thin, wet, tearing cough, the kind that comes up from deep in a small chest and does not want to stop. A girl by the sound. She had been out there some while, waiting. The way the children of the poor wait everywhere, patient as stones. A neighbour of Reed's had come to speak for him, an older woman with a shawl over her head, and she stepped up now, twisting her hands. "Please, your worship," she said. "That's his girl out there. She's poorly, sir, this long while. The damp gets in her chest. They've but the one fire between the three of them, and if you take the cottage—" "Charity," said Thorne, cutting across her as though brushing off a fly, "is not the business of this bench. I sit to weigh debts, not to warm children. If the man wished his daughter kept warm, he ought not to have borrowed money he could not repay." And the gallery tittered again. I want you to sit with that a moment, the way Honoria sat with it, a sick child coughing in the corridor, near enough to hear, and a man in a black robe making a jest of her one fire, and 40 odd people in a warm room finding it funny enough to laugh. Down at his desk, the clerk Pruitt lifted his head. He had been watching the old woman on the pauper's bench for a little while now, the way you watch a thing that nags at the edge of your memory, and when her hand closed on that ring, the light caught it, and Pruitt saw the small black stone, and the small red mark in it, and the small bird with no feet cut into the red. His eyes went wide. He half rose from his stool, his mouth opening, as though a word had come to him from 30 years back and demanded to be spoken. Then he looked at Thorne, and he looked at the whole weight of the court, and his own thin salary, and his own thin courage. And he sat back down. He said nothing. He bent again over his papers, but his hand was not quite steady, and once or twice after that he stole a glance at the back bench, at the old woman in grey-black, who watched everything and asked for nothing. Honoria had seen him rise. She had seen him sink. She filed it away with everything else. The case of Jonah Reed was not yet finished. There was the matter of the deed to settle, the paper Collie wanted signed, and Thorne was reaching for his pen to end it when the old woman on the pauper's bench stood up. She stood the way the old stand, with a hand to the bench and a moment to find her feet, but once she was up straight, straighter than you'd have thought, and her voice, when it came, was clear and level and carried further than she seemed to intend. "Your worship, before you sign, there is a matter of the deed of this house you ought to hear." The room turned to look at her. A shabby old woman, speaking up, unbidden, in the debtor's court. It was almost as good as a play. Thorne looked at her the way you'd look at a dog that had spoken. "The deed of this house," he repeated. "The endowment of this sessions house," Honoria said, "carries conditions. It was given to the town on the sworn term that no man be imprisoned nor stripped of the tools of his trade for a debt under £5 owed upon the poorest ward, and there are further terms besides, touching debts to a single lending house. If you would send for the deed, sir, and read it, you would find that the law you sit beneath is not the only law that governs this room." Now, a wiser man, or even only a more careful one, would have stopped there. He would have wondered how it came to pass that a pauper woman in mended gloves knew the sworn terms of an endowment deed by heart. He would have felt, the way you feel a cold draught from a door you thought was shut, that something in the room was not what it seemed. Silas Thorne felt nothing of the kind. He saw an old beggar woman making herself important, delaying his dinner, correcting him before the gallery, and the only thing that reached him through the fat armour of his own certainty was that he had been contradicted, in his own court, by the lowest creature in the room. His colour went up. He set down his pen. And he leaned forward, and he said it, in a voice pitched to carry to every last one of the 49 souls in that gallery, so that not a person there could fail to hear. This bench has no ear for beggars in borrowed black. He let it land. He enjoyed it landing. Then he lifted one plump hand toward the ushers by the wall. Remove her, and commit the weaver, since he has friends enough to plead for him, but no coin to pay. Perhaps a spell in the House of Correction will teach the pack of them that this court is not a stage for their theatricals. There was laughter now, real laughter, rolling round the gallery, because the great man had put the old woman in her place, and there is no crowd on earth that does not warm to the sight of the small made smaller. 2 ushers pushed off from the wall and came toward the back bench, toward the old woman standing there alone, their hands already lifting to take her by the arms and put her out into the cold square. 49 people watched them come, and 49 people saw what she did. She did nothing. She did not shrink. She did not weep. She did not lift her voice to protest, nor turn to the door to flee before they reached her. She stood where she was, an old woman in worn mourning, and she looked at Silas Thorne on his high seat, a long, steady, measuring look, the look of a person reading the last line of a letter they have long known the ending of. And then, before the usher's hands could close on her, she sat back down. Quietly, deliberately, she gathered her worn skirts, and she took her place again on the pauper's bench, and she folded her hands, and she went on watching, as though the whole matter of her removal were beneath her notice, as though the 2 men reaching for her were of no more account than a drought. It stopped the ushers cold. They looked at each other, and they looked at the magistrate, uncertain now, for there is no rougher work in the world than laying hands on an old woman who will not fight and will not run and only looks at you as if she is sorry for you. Thorne made an impatient noise and waved them back. She was seated, she was silent, she was no longer interrupting. "Let her rot on the bench then," he turned back to the weaver's papers. "The seizure is granted," he said, the loom to be marked for the bailiff at first light. The debtor held over. Next case. Collie at the front allowed himself a small, neat smile and slid the signed order into his leather case. Jonah Reed's shoulders came down as though something inside them had been cut. Out in the corridor, the child coughed, and on the back bench, the shabby widow sat with her hands folded and turned her ring, once, round on her finger, and said not one word more. Now here is where you begin to wonder, along with everyone in that room who had a scrap of curiosity left. Why did she not go? A woman so used, so mocked, so nearly thrown into the street. Why would she stay and sit through the rest of that long grey morning of other people's ruin? Any sensible person would have gathered what dignity was left to her and walked out into the square and never come back. She stayed. She sat through the next case and the one after. And down at his desk, the clerk, Pruitt, could not keep still. He wrote when he was made to write, but between times his eyes kept going to her, and there was something working in his thin grey face, some argument between his fear and his memory that his fear kept winning and his memory would not let die. At last, in a lull, he beckoned a boy who ran errands for the court, a lad of 10 or so who fetched and carried and slept in the coal-hole. He drew the boy close and murmured in his ear, quick and low, and the boy's eyes went round, and he nodded, and he slipped out of a side door and was gone. Where the boy went, nobody in the gallery marked. But he went at a run, and he went in the direction of the old records vault beneath the building, where the deeds and papers of 30 years lay sleeping in the dark. And there was another thing. A second solicitor, a younger man than Collie, sitting off to one side with a client of his own, had been watching the old woman since she stood to speak of the deed. Now he leaned to the man beside him and whispered behind his hand, and the 2 of them looked at her, and looked away, and looked again, the way people do when a suspicion has entered the room that they dare not yet say aloud. Something was moving under the surface of that court. You could feel it, the way you feel a change in the weather before the first drop falls. The magistrate felt nothing. He signed his papers and cleared his docket, and thought about his dinner, and the knighthood he was owed, and the fine favour of the lending men whose business he had served so well that morning. He did not once look closely at the old woman he had mocked. The clock on the wall, 4 minutes slow, ground its way toward noon, and Honoria Rookwood sat on the pauper's bench in her mourning black gone grey at the seams, and waited for the recess, with a folded letter under a black wax seal lying quiet in the dark of her reticule, and the whole weight of what that letter was known to no one in that room but her. The recess bell, when it came, was not a bell at all, but a bailiff's knock on the doorframe, 3 dull raps, and the room unfolded itself, men standing, stretching, reaching for their hats. Thorne swept his papers together without looking up. Collie spoke quietly to his associate, and both of them smiled at something, the kind of smile that belongs to men who have already collected their winnings in their heads. The gallery thinned by half in 4 minutes. Reed was taken to a side room to wait, and the door closed after him with a sound that seemed to Honoria, sitting still where everyone else moved, entirely too final. She did not go out. She waited until the main chamber was empty of everyone but the old usher, who had retreated to his post by the outer door and was examining the ceiling with the glazed attention of a man feigning deafness on principle. When she was satisfied that no one was watching her, not the second solicitor who had left with a glance, not Pruitt who had gone through a door behind the clerk's rail, she reached into her reticule and drew the letter out and laid it on her knee. 3 years she had carried it, 3 years since her solicitor had pressed it on her at the reading of the will, with a face solemn enough for a funeral, which in a manner of speaking it was. She had not opened it. She had not needed to open it. She knew what it contained, because Lord Rookwood had told her himself, the winter before he died, sitting by the library fire with a blanket on his knees and his voice gone careful the way it went, when he wanted to say something he felt certain she would not listen to properly unless he said it slowly. The deed of endowment, he had told her, was drawn with one provision that his solicitors had argued against, and he had kept. The naming and the removal of the Marlcombe stipendiary magistrate rested not with the county justices, not with the Home Office, not with any commission or committee or bench of his peers. It rested with the house of Rookwood. With her, he had said, looking at her over the blanket. With you, now that it comes to it. She had said at the time that she hoped she would never have cause to use it. She pressed the letter flat against her knee. The black wax seal was unbroken, the martlet crest pressed into it clean and deep, the same crest cut into the bloodstone at her knuckle, though the ring had been her husband's, not her own, and she wore it turned inward more often than not, from long habit and longer grief. The outer sheet was addressed in a hand she recognized as her own solicitor's, the wrapper only, and beneath it she could feel the weight of the document proper, folded 3 times as legal instruments are, thicker than you expect. She did not break the seal. She had not come here to remove a man. She had come to see whether the house still kept its word. What she drew from her glove instead was a smaller paper. Not folded with any ceremony, folded the way you fold a bill of sale or a grocer's receipt, because that was what it resembled, and that was, in the essential facts, what it was. She had found it by accident, or near enough to accident, that she was no longer sure the distinction held. In September, making arrangements through her solicitor regarding a parcel of land the Wexbridge Loan and Discount Company held adjacent to a property of hers, she had learned, in the course of a longer conversation, that among the company's more modest assets was a packet of small local debts, unremarkable things, the kind that companies accumulate and sometimes sell in blocks for what they can get. She had bought the block. It was a trifling sum at her scale. She had not known, until 3 weeks ago, that one of the names in the packet was Jonah Reed, handloom weaver, of Marlcombe, 5812s. She had come today because of the first fact, the endowment, the promise, the sessions house her husband built, not because of the second. She folded the receipt back into her glove and sat for a moment with both hands resting quiet on the black wax seal, feeling the pressed wax under her thumb the way you feel a scar you have stopped thinking about. She had not planned this. That was the thing she needed to hold clearly in her mind, because plans and intentions are made of different materials and people confuse them and then wonder why the confusion matters. She had intended to come here and listen. She had intended to see whether a weaver with 7 days' cloth and a sick daughter could get a hearing in the house her husband built for that purpose. She had not planned for Silas Thorne to look at her across a public room before 49 people and call her a beggar in borrowed cloth. But here was the letter, and here was the receipt, and here was the court emptied for its noon recess, and in an hour the bailiff would knock the door frame 3 times again, and the room would fill. She thought of Reed's hands on the dock rail. She thought of the gallery laughing. She thought of her husband's voice by the fire, careful and slow, saying with you, now that it comes to it. She put the sealed letter back in her reticule. Not away, simply back, where she could reach it. When the bailiff knocked, she was already on her feet. The room gathered itself back by degrees, the gallery filling from the upper benches down. Colley resuming his place with the unhurried ease of a man with a signed order in his pocket, the young second solicitor slipping in and taking his seat without looking at her, which told her more than looking would have. Pruitt came through the door behind the clerk's rail and set his papers on his desk and did not raise his eyes. The usher called for order. Thorne came in last, as magistrates do, the room standing and then settling, and he took the bench and nodded to his clerk and asked for the afternoon's first matter. Reed was brought back in. His face had the carefully arranged blankness of a man who has been doing his arithmetic in a side room and does not like the sum. Honoria stood, and the room did not laugh this time. Perhaps it was the recess that had done it. Men who have eaten and stretched their legs come back less certain of their own cruelty. Perhaps it was only that she stood differently now. She did not stand like a petitioner. She stood like a woman who had made up her mind in a quiet room and had come back to say so. She did not speak to the bench. She walked. The aisle between the paupers' benches was narrow, and her worn black brushed the knees of the men she passed. Nobody drew back. Nobody rose. But heads turned, one after another, the way heads turn to follow a drought they cannot name. She walked to the clerk's rail. She stopped before Ambrose Pruitt's desk. Thorne watched her come with the patience of a man watching a fly cross a window pane. "Madam," he said, "the ushers were instructed to remove you. I see they have been merciful." "Do not mistake mercy for permission." Honoria did not answer him. She opened her reticule. She took out the letter, the one folded 3 times, the one with the black wax seal, and she laid it flat on the desk in front of the clerk. Her glove was worn at the thumb. The mourning ring caught the grey light from the high window as her hand withdrew. "Read the endowment, sir," she said. "Aloud, as my husband wrote it." Pruitt did not touch the letter. He looked at it as a man looks at a coal that has jumped the grate onto his floor. "My husband," she said again, gently, because she saw that the word had gone into him and stuck. "Read it as he wrote it." Thorne leaned forward on the bench. "What is this?" "Pruitt, what has she given you?" "A letter, your worship." Pruitt's voice came out thin. "I can see it is a letter. I asked what it is, and here was the thing Honoria had counted on and could not be sure of. She had known Ambrose Pruitt only by his stillness that morning, by the half-rise he had smothered when he saw the crest, by the boy she had watched him send running. She had gambled that a man 30 years in his post keeps his conscience folded away in the same drawer as his pension, and that the two need not always agree, but that when they are laid side by side on a desk in front of him, he will find he cannot lie to both at once. Pruitt picked up the letter. His thumb found the seal. He looked at it a long moment. Then he looked at her hand, at the ring, at the small bird cut into the bloodstone, the martlet, the little footless swallow that never lands, the bird the house of Rookwood had carried on its arms for longer than there had been a Marlcombe to endow. Honoria watched his face do its arithmetic. She watched him arrive at the sum and dislike it exactly as much as Reed had disliked his. He broke the seal. The wax cracked with a small dry sound. In the hush it carried to the gallery. Colley, in his good coat, tilted his head. The young second solicitor, 3 rows back, stopped writing. Pruitt unfolded the letter. He read the first lines to himself. Honoria knew them by heart, for she had folded and unfolded them for 3 years a widow, in the dark, meaning nothing to anyone but her. She watched the colour go out of him. Aloud, "Mist Pruitt," she said. "Your worship," Pruitt began, and his voice broke off, and he tried again, turned to the bench, the paper trembling now in a way he could not stop. "Your worship, this bears the endowment seal. The true one. I have seen it. It is kept in the vault beneath us. The counterpart of it I have. 30 years I have kept these records, and it is a forgery," said Thorne. He said it flatly, the way a man puts down a card he has decided will win. He said it into the middle of Pruitt's stammer, and it cut the stammer off clean. "It is a forgery," Thorne said again, louder, for the gallery. "A poor one. Do you not see what is happening in my court, Pruitt? A vagrant has come in from the road in a dead woman's mourning, and she has bought or stolen a scrap of wax, and she means to frighten a foolish clerk with it. I have seen this trick in 3 boroughs. Strike it from the desk. Strike it from the record. There is no letter." Pruitt did not strike it. He stood holding it, caught between the seal in his hand and the man on the bench, which was precisely the place Honoria had known he would end, and could not spare him. "You call it a forgery," Honoria said. "I call it what it is, madam. Then you have looked at it. I do not need to look at rubbish to know its smell." "No," she agreed. "A man rarely does." Something in the mildness of it reached him where a shout would not have. Thorne's jaw tightened. He had wanted her to weep or to shriek or to run, because those were the shapes a beggar's collapse was supposed to take, and he knew what to do with each of them. He did not know what to do with a woman who agreed with him softly and did not move. "Understand me," Thorne said, and now he came off his patience altogether, because the gallery was too quiet, and he could feel the quiet as a man feels a change in the weather. "You have laid a false instrument before an officer of this court. That is not a small thing, madam. That is a felony. I will give you 1 chance, in my mercy, to take your paper and your rags and your dead lord's ring and go out that door and be grateful. Or I will have you proved. And when the seal is proved false, you will not be committed for debt like your weaver. You will be committed for fraud. Do you understand what I am offering you?" "I understand it perfectly," said Honoria. "You are offering to prove the seal. I am offering you the door." "And I decline the door," she said, "and accept the proving." "Prove it, sir. You have a vault beneath this floor. My husband built it to hold the counterpart of the very paper in your clerk's hand. Send for it. Lay the 2 together. If they do not match, commit me, and I will go where you send me and make no sound. If they do match, she let it hang." She did not finish it. She had learned from the letter itself the power of a thing folded and not opened. "They will not match," Thorne said. But he had said it too quickly, and the second solicitor 3 rows back heard the quickness and wrote something down. "Then you lose nothing by sending," Honoria said, and Pruitt, who had stood these long minutes with the broken seal in his fingers and his 30 years pressing on his shoulders, did the bravest thing his cowardice had ever permitted him. He said, "Your worship, there is no need to send." Thorne turned on him. "What?" "There is no need to send below, your worship. The counterpart is already fetched up." Pruitt's throat worked. "Aye, this morning, when the lady's case was, when I saw thee, I sent the boy. The vault boy. For the counterpart. It is here. The silence in the sessions house changed its character. Before it had been the silence of a crowd waiting to see a beggar humiliated. Now it was the other kind, the kind that comes into a room when the crowd realizes it may have picked the wrong side and cannot yet be sure. "You sent," Thorne said slowly, "without my order. You sent a boy into the records vault on the say-so of that, on the say-so of the crest, your worship." Pruitt had found something now, some floor under his feet, and his voice steadied on it. The martlet, I have inked it into the head of every deed this house has issued for 30 years. I would know it in the dark. I saw it on her hand this morning, and God forgive me, I sat down again. But I sent the boy. He bent below his desk. There was a leather roll there, tied with faded tape, that had not been there that morning, that a lad of 10 or so had carried up at a run from the dark beneath the building, and laid at the clerk's feet during the recess, without a word to anyone. Pruitt untied the tape. He drew out the counterpart deed. He set it on the desk beside the letter Honoria had laid down, and he turned both so the seals lay next to each other, the fresh broken one and the old one, under the grey window light, before the bench and before the gallery of 49 souls who had laughed that morning. He bent over them. He was a long time. It was very quiet. The clock on the wall, the one that ran 4 minutes slow, ticked into the quiet, and everyone heard it, who had never once heard it before. "They match," said Ambrose Pruitt. He straightened. He was pale, but he was steady, and there was in his voice now the particular calm of a frightened man who has stopped being frightened because the worst has already happened and he is still standing. "The wax is from the same matrix. The martlet, the mullet beneath it, the lettering of the motto, they are struck from one seal. This is no forgery, your worship. This is the endowment." And this, he lifted the letter she had carried 3 years, and his hand did not shake now, this is the counterpart held by the House of Rookwood, as the deed itself provides it should be. "Read it," Honoria said. "The name, Mr. Pruitt. Read the name into the record." And Pruitt read it. He read it in the flat, careful voice of a clerk, entering a fact that will outlast every man in the room, and it fell on the Sessions House like snow. "Given under my hand and seal," he read, "Honoria, Dowager Lady Rookwood, patroness of this house, widow of Charles, Lord Rookwood, who endowed it." Nobody laughed. That was the thing she noticed, in the strange stretched moment after, that not one soul laughed, and that the not laughing was louder than the laughter had been. She heard a chair scrape somewhere in the gallery as a man half rose, and thought better of it. She heard Colley's breath go out of him. The agent of the Wexbridge Loan and Discount Company had come into this room that morning with a signed seizure order under his arm and the easy face of a man collecting what the law had already promised him, and now the easy face was gone, and he was looking at the shabby widow on the pauper's bench and doing the sum that Pruitt had done and Thorne would not. The 2 ushers who had been told to take her arm had drifted, over the long minutes, to stand near her again out of old habit, ready for the order to be repeated. Now they stepped back from her, both of them at once, without being told, the way men step back from a fire that has flared. One of them looked at his own hand, as if it had almost done a thing he would not have forgiven it. Honoria stood in the space they had left around her. She did not enjoy it. She had thought, in the grey mornings of 3 years, that she might enjoy it, and she found now that she did not, and she was glad to find it. She had not come to be feared. She had come to be heard. But she had learned from a hard master that sometimes the only door to being heard runs straight through being feared, and that a woman who will not walk through it leaves the poorest voice in the room to be shouted down by the loudest. She turned, at last, to the bench. Silas Thorne had not moved. His hands were on the rail of it, the good rail, the polished one, and his knuckles had gone the colour of the wax. He was a clever man. Honoria would grant him that even now. She watched him understand, in the space of 3 or 4 seconds, everything that his cleverness had built and everything it had just cost him. She watched the knighthood die in his face. She watched him reach, the way a falling man reaches, for the one branch left. "Even so," he said. His voice had lost its carrying edge. "Even so, madam, a patroness, a benefactress. The house owes you its stones. I do not dispute it. But the bench is the bench. The magistracy is a crown appointment. You may have built these walls. You do not sit in this chair, and you do not say who does. That is the law, and not even a lord's widow is above it. He had found the branch. It was a good branch. In 9 cases in 10 it would have held him. "Read on, Mr. Pruitt," said Honoria. Pruitt read on. He had reached in the letter the clause that mattered, and he read it slowly, because he had inked its like into deeds for 30 years, and had never once thought to read what it truly said. "And it is my will," he read, "and the condition of this my gift, that the naming of the stipendiary who shall sit in this house, and the removal of him, shall rest not with the crown, nor the bench, nor any interest of trade, but with my house and my heirs, that the poorest voice in Marlcombe shall never want a friend at the door who cannot be bought. This power I reserve to the house of Rookwood, and to my lady after me, so long as one stone of this house stands upon another." Pruitt lowered the paper. "It is under the same seal, your worship," he said quietly, "the one you have just seen matched." The Crown consented to the terms when it took the endowment. It is 30 years' law. I have the ratification below, if you would have the boy fetch that too. Thorne did not want the boy to fetch anything more. Honoria let the quiet sit a moment. Then she spoke, and she did not raise her voice, because the whole point of the mourning, the whole point of the deed and the letter and the 3 years of carrying it, was that the poorest voice should not have to be raised to be heard, and she would not now win by shouting the things she had come to prove. "Then hear me, sir," she said. "The bench beneath you was my husband's gift to the poorest of this town. It is not entailed to your contempt. Its keeping and its keeper are mine to name and mine to unname." She turned the ring on her finger once, the small habitual quarter turn, the martlet coming round into the light and going out of it. "You called a weaver a professional pauper," she said, "for asking 7 days to sell his cloth. You told a sick child that charity is not the business of this bench. You called me a beggar in borrowed black, and told your ushers to put me in the street, in the house my husband built, so that no one in Marlcombe should ever be put in the street unheard. You did all of this before 49 people, this morning, believing there was no one in the room who could make you answer for it." She looked at him. "You were wrong about who was in the room," she said. "That is all. That is the whole of it. A man should look closer before he decides a face is not worth the looking." And then she did the thing the premise of her whole life had taught her, the thing her husband had done by the fire when a man's argument was not worth the breath to break. She turned away from him. She turned her shoulder to the bench and the man on it, and she faced the clerk. And by the turning she said more plainly than any sentence that Silas Thorne was no longer a thing she needed to look at. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "as is my right under the deed you hold, and before these witnesses, I remove Silas Thorne from the magistracy of this house. Enter it. He will vacate the bench." "You cannot," Thorne said, and got no further, because Pruitt was already writing, the pen going steady across the page, in the hand of a man who had waited 30 years for one clean thing to do, and had nearly missed it, and the scratch of the nib in the silent room was answer enough. The colour that had left Thorne's face did not come back. He looked at the rail under his knuckles. It was the bench he had sat in that morning, owning every soul who came before it, and he understood now that he had never owned it at all, that he had been lent it by the house of the very woman he had ordered thrown into the street, and that the lending was ended. There was one thing more, and Honoria had left it for last on purpose, because it was the only part of the morning that was truly kind, and she had learned that the kind thing lands hardest when it comes after the hard one. She drew the second paper from her glove, the small one, folded like a bill of sale, the one that had lain against her palm all morning while Thorne mocked and the gallery laughed. She stepped to the end of the clerk's rail, nearest where Collie sat with his ruined seizure order still under his arm, and she laid the paper down in front of the agent of the Wexbridge Loan and Discount Company. 3 weeks ago, she said, I bought a block of small debts from your company's ledger, sir. Bad debts, your clerk called them. Not worth the collecting. I bought them without knowing one name upon the list, as a lady buys a thing she thinks she may one day mend. One of those names was Jonah Reed. £58, 12 shillings. She touched the paper with one gloved finger. That debt is mine now, not yours. Your order to seize his loom is an order to seize it on my account. I did not give it, and I do not give it, and I will not. She looked up at Collie. The debt is cancelled, forgiven, in full, before these witnesses. There is nothing owing. There is nothing to seize. Take your paper, sir. It buys you nothing here. Collie opened his mouth. He was a man who dealt in the one paper that mattered, the signed order, the thing the law would enforce, and he had built his whole confident mourning on the certainty that his was the only paper in the room with teeth. He looked at the cancelled debt. He looked at the woman who held, it turned out, both the bench above him and the ledger behind him. He shut his mouth. He reached under his arm and drew out the leather case with the signed seizure order in it, and he did not lay it on any desk, he only put it away, back into his coat. The way a man pockets a coin he has found to be counterfeit, and does not wish anyone to see him having held. The gallery murmured. It was a low sound, and it ran along the benches, and it was not the sound of that morning. That morning the room had made one sound. The titter, the laugh, 49 throats agreeing to despise a small man for the sport of it. This was many sounds, and they did not agree, and under them ran a single note that had not been in the room all day, which was shame, the particular shifting shame of people who laughed at a thing in the morning and have been shown by evening what they laughed at. And Jonah Reed at the dock rail, who had stood through all of it with the arranged blankness of a man expecting the worst and refusing to let it see him flinch, Jonah Reed took his hands off the rail. That was all he did. He did not weep, and he did not thank her, not yet, not there. The thanks came later, at a door, with his cap in his hands, and is not part of this. There in the court he only unclenched his fingers from the wood he had gripped since morning, and turned his hands over, and looked at them, at the calluses the loom had put there, the loom that was his still, in the cottage that was his still, where a fire he need not share now with the bailiff would burn for a daughter who might yet mend. His knuckles came back from white by slow degrees. It was the smallest thing in the room, and it was the whole of what the room was for. Honoria gathered her letter from the clerk's desk. She folded it again, 3 times along the old creases, and put it back in her reticule. She left the counterpart with Pruitt, where it belonged, in the keeping of the house. She did not look again at Silas Thorne, who sat gripping a bench that was no longer his, while the clerk's pen finished the line that unmade him. She went out the way she had come in, up the narrow aisle between the paupers' benches, in mourning black gone grey at the seams, an old woman, Shabby, for whom that morning not one soul in Marlcombe had risen to give a chair. They rose now, all of them. Bench by bench, the whole gallery of 49, they got to their feet as she passed, and nobody had told them to, and she had not asked it, and she did not slow to receive it. She only went out through the door into the grey Lancashire noon, and the door swung shut behind her, and that is where the laughing court fell silent for good. Now, let me tell you how it stood 6 months on, because a story is only worth the telling if you know what grew from it, and something did grow. Go to Marlcombe in the spring and find the Sessions House on the square, and you will see, beside the door, a new brass plate kept bright. There is a line cut into it, and the line is not the magistrate's name. For that is how they used to mark such doors. The line is from the deed. It says, "The poorest voice heard first." People stop and read it. Most do not know the story behind it. That is all right. A promise does not need its story known to be kept. Inside, on quarter day, the benches fill as they always filled. But a weaver who asks 7 days to sell his cloth gets his 7 days now, and a sick child in the corridor is a reason for care and not a joke for the gallery, because the man who sits the bench knows, as every man who sits it now will always know, exactly whose gift the chair beneath him is, and exactly how it can be taken back. Go out to the edge of the town, to a cottage with one good window, and you will hear a loom. It is Jonah Reed's, and the shuttle goes steady, back and forth, the sound a man makes when he is paying no debt but the debt of the day's work. His daughter sits in the window with the mending in her lap. She coughs less this spring than last. That is not a miracle, and I will not dress it as one. It is only what a warm fire and an unseized roof will sometimes do for a child, given time. The very 7 days, and the 7 after them, that a bench once would not grant. Ambrose Pruitt is senior clerk of the Marlcombe Sessions House now, and will be until he chooses to lay it down. He is a plain man, and he was a frightened one, and he found on one grey morning that 30 years of keeping his post and his conscience in separate drawers had left him just enough of both to do one right thing when it was laid on his desk. Men speak well of him. He does not correct them, but he knows the truth of it, which is that he very nearly sat still. The martlet, he says, when he inks it now into the head of a deed, the martlet is a bird that never lands, and he thinks he understands at last why a house would choose it, because a promise, like that bird, cannot afford to come to rest. And Silas Thorne? There is one thing to say of him, and I will say it plainly and leave him. He practices law now in a town some distance off, a town that never asks who endowed the roof over his head, which suits him, for it is the one question he can no longer bear. The knighthood did not come. It was never going to come to a man put out of his seat by the widow he called a beggar. He does his work. He is careful, now with faces he does not know. That much, at least, the mourning taught him. It is more than most men learn, and it cost him everything he had, and that is the price of the lesson for a man who will not learn it any cheaper. As for Honoria, Dowager Lady Rookwood, she went home that same evening in the same worn black, for it was her only mourning, and she saw no reason to buy another. She keeps the deed in its box still. Now and again she takes it out and folds and unfolds it, along the old creases, 3 times, the way she did through 3 years of dark, when it meant nothing to anyone but her. Then she seals it away again, and turns the ring on her finger once, the martlet coming round into the light and going out of it, and she gets on with the quiet business of an old woman in a large empty house. She would tell you she did nothing remarkable. She would tell you she only went to see whether a court kept its word, and finding it did not, said so, with the one voice the law had given her that no one thought to check she carried. But I will tell you the thing she would not, because it is the whole of what her husband meant, and the whole of why the plate by the door reads as it does. A bench is only as noble as the least person it will stoop to hear. A town is only as just as it is to the man it is easiest to ignore, and the ones who look shabby, the ones in borrowed-looking black on the hard back benches, the ones no one rises to give a chair, look closer at them, always, before you decide what they are worth. You do not know what any of them is carrying, folded 3 times, sealed and held for years against the morning it is finally needed. If this story reached your town, I would like to know it. Tell me where you're watching from.